Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Sex Sales Podcast, the podcast where we talk about culture, behavior, relationships, and society from a male and a female perspective. Today we're talking about emotional labor. So, I'll let Eliza do everything on this one, and I'll just make some jokes. That was the first one. I hope that was funny, but nonetheless, we are talking about emotional labor. And just a quick definition of emotional labor. Emotional labor is the process of managing feelings and expressions to fulfill the emotional requirements of a job. So, more specifically, workers are expected to regulate their emotions during interactions with customers, coworkers, clients, and managers, and that's in a professional context. But I want to also talk about emotional labor in a personal context. Subscribe if you haven't already on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube, Sex Sales Podcast. Come to a comedy show, comedyuntamed.com if you live in Australia. Come see me live, my solo show, neilkahacker.com/tickets. But first I want to get your overview of emotional labor. If someone asks you what is emotional labor, because this is a term that's thrown around a lot now. And when I was a kid, I don't really remember hearing this that often. It could be because I was a kid and kids wouldn't be talking about this. But it does seem to be in the zeitgeist a lot more now than it was. So first, I want to gauge your just brief opinion and definition of emotional labor, because sometimes it's a subjective sort of phrase, and then I want to talk about my idea of it, and we can get into a discussion of it. So take it away.
So the definition that you read out is the formal definition, and it was actually coined in like the 80s, and it was specifically supposed to be the definition only encompassing emotional tasks at work. So for example, nurses needing to have a lot of empathy for their patients, or flight attendants would have to be polite and smile. So that is where the term was coined. And then as the years have passed, which is why you probably hadn't heard of it for a long time, emotional labor has developed almost into a new definition that we know to now and today about the mismatched labor that someone has to do, or the unseen labor that falls upon someone, typically of the emotional support, obviously, that can create a discrepancy in a personal relationship. So just like a very broad example and a very classic trope would be the mother who is feeling a lot of contempt and dissatisfaction with her husband, and is feeling really exhausted because she's had to plan all the doctor's appointments, she had to make sure her children were happy, she had to make sure the husband was happy, she had to enroll him in school, do this, make sure this list was done, like all that, all these tasks that were completed that she has to keep in her head, the routines, etc., nap time, that he is not aware of or not engaged in. And he's like, what do you mean? You had the kids for 4 hours and then I had the kids for 4 hours today. We did the same amount of work with the kids, but it's that invisible labor that is missing. And so this, one of the big reasons for why this has kind of come up again in recent times, I believe, is because of the movement of feminism, where it's like usually there is someone that is managing the household more, or overlooking all the domestic duties, or paying the bills, or doing like that household management, and also at the same time trying to better their partner and teach them emotional regulation or emotional intelligence and communication skills, that all of that responsibility and monitoring or whatever is falling onto one person, and then it's uneven between the two, or in the friendship group, or the relationship, etc. What are your thoughts?
That's a great definition, and I think that's exactly what people are talking about now when they speak about it in a broader sense than just in a professional environment. And taking on the necessary stress for the adequate management of a household or organization. Would you say that's a accurate and brief one-sentence definition of it? Because if you're managing a house or a small business or whatever it may be, there are certain tasks that need to be done, obviously, for things to be managed effectively. And some people just naturally gravitate towards a managerial role. Some people, it's their job to do that, particularly more so in the professional world. But the person who gravitates towards that managerial role tends to take on more stress, that then creates that emotional imbalance, emotional inequality, and then can harbor a lot of resentment, thinking,
Yeah.
well, I have to think about all these things because I cannot trust that if I leave this to you, either it wouldn't be done properly or,
Yeah.
it just wouldn't be done at all.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is that it's coinciding a lot with resentment because of it, because of these responsibilities that fall onto that individual. And now that there is a term and understanding being developed about it, people are talking about it a lot more, being like, well, you might think just because you work 40 hours and I work 30 hours that you're doing more, but in reality, I'm literally managing this house, or I'm managing this organization. I'm keeping things running. It may not be like on KPI type levels of keeping things running, but I'm the glue that is holding things together. Or like I always think that, which I guess is like a petty thought, that if I had to leave, as much as I have these conversations with Adrian and he understands it, and I'm the stay-at-home parent currently, but if I had to leave for the weekend, I couldn't just up and leave and be like, okay, I would have fucking 10 pages of lists of Remy's routine, what to feed him, how to cook it, how does he like this being done, like how to put him down for his nap, when to wake him up, how long to let him sleep for, all these things that it's like, well, Adrian's a parent, he should know these things off by heart. And that's the emotional labor that I'm currently like working with at the moment. And I think that in a non-parent type relationship, a lot of women complain about an emotional labor because of that they have to be the ones to regulate their partners for them. And a lot of men do that for women too. That's probably even, but having to be the person being like, okay, you're upset, so now instead of regulating yourself or calming yourself down, I have to take on the responsibility of, or not have to, but I choose to, or I fall into being the person that takes on the responsibility of calming you down and getting you back to your baseline and putting your needs there, etc. So I do think resentment comes in at least after a while. A lot of resentment is building up and building up and building up. And now that there's a term for it and people are understanding it, they're trying to have more conversations about it, and do something about it. But it's one of those things that it's really hard to address, to share the division, because it's not like you're like, okay, you mop the floor on Tuesdays, I'll mop it on Fridays. It's not often tangible. So it is really hard to divide that equally and be fair. So it's a tricky thing.
And would you say that there are natural managers, in the sense that in any kind of social organization, some people just for whatever reason they gravitate towards that managerial role? And I'm not
Yeah.
talking about just a household here.
Yeah.
Maybe they're just hiring conscientiousness and also agreeableness. I'm just assuming here that I haven't really seen any particular literature on that. And then because that person tends to gravitate towards that managerial role, it then just becomes stuck in everyone's mind. Oh yeah, they'll take care of that.
Yes.
And then they
So true.
harbor the resentment because they think, well, I initially was happy to do it because I want this organization or this household to be run as effectively as possible.
Yeah.
But now I'm doing it, and there's no even it's not just that people want a thanks. It's just that I have to do more here, and the other person might say, or the other people in the organization might say, well, you never tell us to do this, or you never give us the opportunity to do this. And then occasionally that does lie on the natural manager, where they may have a need to control everything to the detriment of everyone else's development. And they think, well, because if you do it, you'll do it in a bad way. And then that can really piss people off and actually create resentment the other way. So there are, like with all of these issues, there are always two sides to the coin.
That's so true. Yeah.
But it seems more often than not, the person who's doing the management duties, first of all, these are often very thankless. They're just the really boring nitty gritty day to day. Oh, make sure this is done. Make sure we've got to have food here, and then we've got to make sure we've got to do this, and then you have to overthink that because you're not confident that the other person is thinking that. Now, then, from the other person's perspective, they may say, "Well, I just don't express that stress outwardly in the same way you do," and sometimes natural managers assume, "Oh, the other people aren't as stressed or aren't necessarily talking overtly about the things that need to be done. Therefore, they're not thinking about it," which may not always be the case. I know in the small organization I'm running, that's come up where someone has felt like they've gravitated towards a natural managerial role. They weren't specifically asked to do that, and then there's not resentment necessarily, but a fear that it won't be done as effectively, and then they want it to be at a certain standard. But then the other person has said, "Where you're making these assumptions, like you've never actually let me take on this role," and that then the other person the natural manager can sometimes become a bit domineering in certain situations where they think, okay, I'll give you a chance to do it. No. Here, let me do. I'll just do it. Do it. And okay, you haven't actually allowed that person to step up. So it's something I've been thinking about a fair bit, and more so in a professional context, because I've always just lived alone, so I've always been okay, for the last 6-7 years. But yeah, in a professional organization, there just seems to be certain people who naturally gravitate towards that role, and then if they don't feel like they're getting a proper it's usually not even just a financial reward, just the acknowledgement and just the appreciation, there's a certain level of resentment that tends to develop. And it's something that I think a lot of organizations are trying to manage, and I think it really just comes down to certain aspects of culture, but also the human condition.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think that even outside of career and work, in any social group or setting, there is, like you said, the natural manager, and that is a role I have taken on in every group I'm in. Like I actually don't feel resentment for it. I kind of enjoy doing it, but like with my friend group, I initiate all of the catch-ups. And when I was pregnant and like basically isolating due to COVID, none of my friends saw each other because I wasn't creating the opportunity for catch-up or planning anything or writing the chat, so that it just fell flat for months and months and months until I had my baby. And even like when I joined a new group, my mother's group, someone said they felt like playing netball, so then I created the netball team. I paid for it. I organized the funds. I organized the schedule of who's playing what position. I organize the catch-ups a lot. At the start of the month, I also send like, okay, here are some dates for a baby catch-up. Here are some dates for the mum catch-ups. When we go out for dinner, I usually often pay, and then everyone pays me back. So it's funny how like
people the person who offers to pay. Yeah.
Yeah. I know that one's annoying, but no, it's all right. But it's funny how like that's always something I've just naturally done, being like, except in the scenario of this podcast, which I think is interesting. In probably every other situation, I'm always the one that is like leading the planning and the organizing and the ideas. But when it comes to like podcasts, etc., and this scenario, this is something I'm like, Neil's much more has much more expertise in this, so I always follow your lead. Every time you're like, what do you want to do with this, or I'm like, I'll do what you want to do. Like if it were anyone else, I'd probably be like, this is what I want to do, this and this, but like I trust you. You're definitely the natural manager in out of our duo, or out of the podcast. But in any other situation, household, relationships, friendships, I find that I definitely tend to fall into that role. But what do you like, I guess, in outside of a career way, like in your relationship or in your friendships? Are you that person, or are you the passenger?
It's a good question. Because again, I still don't. Andrew and I don't live together, so I'm just the manager of my household, single person household.
Well, do you have days, like specific days that you catch up, or do you just every week you're like, hey, come around tonight? Like who organizes that?
Yeah, we plan. We're both planners. I think the best way I would still describe it is we're both builders from that Why Him,
Yeah.
Why Her book. And that work, if you're a builder, if you're someone like me who might be more of a natural manager, you need to find a partner who's also like that, because nothing will
Yeah.
frustrate you. Will just go, you'll go insane if you're not with someone who's like that.
Yeah.
But I don't know, you'd have to ask her, but I think we're doing a sort of pretty 50-50 burden of that. Because it's not, again, there's not a lot of sort of boring things to do yet, because we're still not living together. And
Yeah.
we're just essentially organizing when we usually have, it's usually either Friday or Saturday, and then either Monday or Tuesday, and then, we just figure out who's going to whose house. And it's the management is relatively easy at this stage of the relationship. So I'll report back when we're in a more in a different situation.
Yeah.
In previous relationships, again, I've never really had a live-in girlfriend, and then I think that's
Yeah.
because more often than not, my partner's not lived with me. I know. Look, growing up, mum, as is usually the case, was the manager.
Hi, Shorty. I haven't seen her in ages.
Yeah, she hasn't really jumped up that often. And then the funny thing is, well, my dad wanted to. There was a while there where I think he wanted to take on more of that household role. But then when someone, like with any skill, a natural manager has usually done it for so many years that they're just so much better at it that when someone, even if they want to make an effort to do it, they try it for a while, and then the natural manager thinks, oh, look, I need to do it. And that can be detrimental for their development.
For both people.
But
it's hard, yeah.
Yeah, it is hard because then, but if it's just so bad that if they're just so useless at managing the household or whatever, and then look, this might be a bit mean, but if they're just not as competent at it, it's hard then for that, because usually the natural manager type is controlling is a strong word, often has negative connotations. They're conscientious, and they really have attention to detail is really important to them.
Yeah.
And for other people, it might not be. And they're often more relaxed and happier, and they have other advantages that they can bring to an organization or a relationship. But then when you sort of switch those roles, if someone who doesn't have a good sense for attention to detail is trying to do the management of a household or an organization, they're usually just not that good at it, and the organization probably selects for people who are natural managers. And usually that's why managers often get paid a bit more than the other people who might be doing the same amount of hours but different tasks, because it's it's arduous. I think a really probably the most pertinent example I can think of is on a film set. Anyone who's in the film world will tell you the assistant director is the manager of that film set. Because
Really?
because the director is the person who gets to enact their creative vision. They're just looking at the shot. They're telling the actors, "This is my vision. This is how I want you to act." I want the DOP is the person with the camera. They're directing them, telling them, "All right, close up here or wide here or pan here or whatever it might be." They get to be creative, right? And then that's usually more enjoyable. But still, it's stressful for everyone. Don't get me wrong. The actors get to act. So they're having the time of their life, usually. If they're doing a dramatic scene, that's actually quite hard. That's actually, what? That would literally be emotional labor if you have to cry for multiple scenes throughout the day.
Yeah.
But the assistant director, and then the people, if we're talking about a really big film set, the people under the assistant director, oh my God, they're just the people getting coffees, but they just get tossed around like they're slaves at some point. They're usually interns studying film or something like that. But the assistant director, at least in most of the film sets I've worked on, is the person who has the schedule, who's telling everyone, this is what we need to do. Where's this person? They're wrangling everyone onto the set. Wow. They're making sure that person's there when they need to be. They're making sure that prop's there when it needs to be there. They're making sure that they're sticking to time. And more often than not, the director will actually lose a sense of time because they're so immersed in the art that the assistant director actually then has to come on and be like, okay, look, come on, why isn't this happening? And then the assistant director often has to answer to the producer. The producer's like, why didn't you get all these shots done? And then it can be
Yeah.
it can be awkward, but
That's so interesting.
you
I would
know,
never even thought of it. Like you wouldn't. I didn't even know an assistant director existed. Yet they're literally like running the show.
well, they're doing the thankless work.
Yeah.
No one is like, oh, who's gonna get the Oscar for assistant director? But they're essential to every film set. Now, usually,
Yeah.
and then look, different film sets can do it differently. And by the way, if you're in the film industry, maybe there's a different way of doing it. Tell me in the comments. But a film cannot actually, come to fruition in its best possible conception without an assistant director being there, making sure every little thing goes as planned. And what can happen is someone who might have both natural managerial aptitudes and creative aptitudes, their creative side has to then be suppressed or has to suffer because they're so focused on getting everything in order and getting everything managed. And that can be another way where the resentment can build up because they think, well, I'm not able to like contribute my ideas and my vision because I'm too busy telling everyone where they have to be and what they have to do and making the calls and sending all the emails and doing, essentially the boring work. Some people like it and they're God's gift to earth. We all love them. But and also usually the assistant director is someone who wants to eventually become a director.
Yeah.
So it's actually a good sort of learning process. You go through that and then you get to do you get all the accolades and you get to do arguably the more enjoyable job.
That's so interesting and such a good example as well.
In my professional life, I would say that's just a perfect example. In other situations, there's been people who've shared that managerial burden. But yeah, in film, it's usually the assistant director, or then, if it's a bigger film set, there's producers as well. And they often answer to the assistant director. So actually, in a big film set, the assistant director is actually managing the managers. And, in any big corporate environment, there's just people there's like a chain of managers that just are managing each other. And it just gets so ridiculous at some point. And, there's that really funny guy on TikTok. What's his name? Nick White or something. And he does that, I don't know if you've seen that sketch. It's just like every manager or something. And he'll be that really passive aggressive kind of manager who's like,
Is
oh,
he
have you
brunette
done
with like
that?
kind of curly hair?
He's a guy, but then he does it as a woman, and then he'll be like,
She's married to Matt. Yeah.
I'm gonna need you to do that, otherwise I'm gonna get in trouble. Yeah, it's
I
so on point.
His videos.
It's so on
They're
point.
So good.
It's scarily realistic. But then I feel for that person as well because they often become the asshole because they have to be because otherwise people don't listen. And it's not fun being again, some people actually truly enjoy it. But for a lot of people, it's sort of a means to an end, or it's something that they feel they either naturally gravitated towards or are best at and feel like that's what they have to do. And, that it can create, personality traits that aren't ideal because they're always on edge and they're always stressed and they're always having to think about things. And these are the people who often have to take their work home because everyone else finishes at 5 or 6 p.m. But then they're always thinking about, okay, is everything going to happen properly tomorrow?
Yeah.
And I suppose that's a good rundown of how issues of emotional labor manifest in a professional environment. And look, again, in most of these situations, that person's being paid for that emotional labor, so it sort of works out, but not always. And then in a household, I'd imagine it's just even more resentment could build up because, well, it's also, the one person, if it's a traditional sort of household, one person's bringing in the money, so it's not like they're doing nothing. And sometimes the household manager assumes that they're doing everything and that can upset the other person quite a lot, understandably. But it's a tricky one because, you want people to appreciate and be able to do what you might be doing as the manager, but then vice versa, the person who might be working long hours in a tough job might think, well, you don't exactly know what I'm doing as well. I'm contributing to this quite a lot. I'm going through a lot of stress, and it can be just a messy and toxic situation all around, can't it?
It absolutely can, and it's something that I see a lot, in particularly in relationships, where like when you were talking about how someone often manages like the domestic duties in the household, and when they ask for help, then that person does such a poor job. They're like, "Oh fuck, I'll just do it." Like, and whether or not that person is weaponized incompetence, where it's basically like, "Oh, I don't know how to cook onions. Like, I can't do dinner," like that kind of thing, where it's intentionally bad or unintentional. It builds so much resentment and passive aggressiveness, and it gets to a point where, as they say, John Gottman says, in your relationship, the biggest indicator of divorce is contempt. And that is one of those things that causes contempt. And in my relationship, I find that I actually am experiencing like the impact to a much, much smaller scale, less, doesn't really like bother me too much, but it's something we've been talking about. I'm experiencing the impact of emotional labor, in the sense that it's like Adrian always loves about me. Like he always says, I love that. Like you're like the leader in the relationship, and just what you say goes, and you organize this and it's like sorted or whatever. And I loved or used to love that too, but now I'm like exhausted because I'm so tired, so sleep deprived. And that's when I've started to become really conscious of it. And it's like, it's such a routine in our relationship that he will just, instead of trying to find information himself, he'll just ask me. Like I'm his Google basically. And I get like major decision fatigue, where he'll be like, what are we doing this weekend? And instead of being like, check the calendar, I'll run through the 10 things we're doing this weekend. So now we have a rule that he cannot ask me any questions about plans when I'm in bed, because that's every time I'm about to doze off to sleep, that's when he starts asking me like something about some plan, and I hate it. And even just like to a smaller scale as well, like he'll be like, how much longer is left in this movie? And I'll be like, do you want me to check? Because we both use like Apple Remote on our phones. We're both up, like he just expects me to know almost. And I'm like, why don't you look? Like those kind of like little questions that he just instinctively asks me. Whereas I'm like, can't, like just now I'm at the point where I'm so tired, just figure it out. Like just fucking sort it out. And then to like a more, I guess, obvious extent, where I try to give him, for example, the reins on some things, but I like struggle to, like when it comes to like say feeding Remy, I'll be like, can you, instead of being like, can you give him lunch, I'll be like, okay, can you cook him the lentils, and this is how you cook it, and then I put it with this pasta, and then boil the sweet potato for 10 minutes, and then mash it in and add this in. And then because I've given so many directions, he will ask me 14 times, wait, how long? Like what? This, that? And I'll be like, I'm going to have a bath. But then when I'm in the bath, all I'm thinking is, I'm trying to relax. I'm like, okay, did he do it right?
And that's what
did
happened.
Did he give him water? Did he put the bib on? Did he clean? Did he check his nappy? Like I can't relax.
It's hard to detach, isn't it? Yeah.
It's so hard. And that's only something that's been like a new issue for me, because like I used to be a chronic napper. I'd sleep 9 hours at night and take a nap basically every day. Now when I get the opportunity to nap on the weekend, when Adrian's like, I'll take Remy for 4 hours, go nap, I can't. I just cannot. I can't stop thinking about them. Like it's so annoying.
And
so, yeah.
you know, it's, well, look, I don't know too much about the household situation, but in a professional situation, the inability to detach can then be an unfortunate consequence of people who are the natural manager, and that can almost be almost like extra emotional labor that they have to do then, because then they have to learn how to detach and make a conscious effort to sort of figure that out. at the same time, because people are at different, developmental stages of managerial capabilities, or some people are just naturally better at it. It's worthwhile allowing, like, if someone told me that, when it comes to delegating things in an organization, it's like, okay, if someone can do it 80% as good as you can, do it. Like, let them do it. And then you have to
Yeah.
detach from that and say, all right, look,
That's
it's not going to be
great.
to my standard, but I cannot get stressed.
Yeah.
It's actually worse for yourself
Yeah.
and for the organization. And,
Yeah.
that's something I've tried to implement where if, look, they can do it 80% as well as I can, that's fine. I can't
Yeah.
sit there and get, you can't, because then, the manager can sometimes have a tendency to can become overbearing because they think, oh, you're not doing it the
Then it's
exact same way
micromanaging.
I'm doing it. And then, you end up micromanaging them, or you end up giving them too many instructions. And then they sort of don't know. They think, well, I did it and I made the effort to do it. And look, I'm doing the planning, but
Yeah.
because it's not to the standard that you're used to, you still get mad at them. And then, in that situation, if they're doing it to sort of 80%, even sort of 70%, I mean, when it comes to things like a baby and things like that, it might be different. But if we're talking about just household chores and things, if I think that 80% rule can apply as well in a household, where if the person who's
Yeah.
not the natural manager can do it 80% as good as you, all right, just let them do it. Give them
Yeah,
the opportunity to
100%.
step up
Yeah.
in that sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think especially when it comes to things like cleaning or the way you stack the dishwasher or the way you do something or the way you cook your onions, like even if you disagree but they're just trying to do it, just let them do it. Like just out of sight, out of mind. Just leave it. I think
And
just take a step back
and then you can get into that mother-child dynamic as well, which can
That was gonna be my
exacerbate the
next
resentment.
point.
And it just, that's where
Yeah.
like a lot of attraction gets lost. Because
Yeah.
if you're feeling like, okay, I'm a parent to this person rather
Yes.
than a partner, well then, no one's gonna, that's not conducive for sexual
Yeah.
attraction.
Yes.
So yeah, look, it can be a messy sort of situation, and there's a biological component to this, because all the studies that I've read at least show that women on average have just much more attention to detail, organizational capability, and then sort of being able to manage a social group. That was what they did for most of our history while the men were out hunting or whatever. So now that we're in a situation where there's more demand for emotional labor and managerial skills, it's actually an advantage for women economically, but it can also be a disadvantage in a relationship. And again, don't get me wrong, there's still many situations where it goes the other way, or where the manager is actually being overbearing or being unnecessarily hypercritical, and this is all very contextual. But
Yeah.
that's usually what happens. If I was trying to come up with a joke the other day saying, all right, you got to rather than like expecting men to be maybe as good as the average woman with the household things, they should have a basic level of knowledge and competency. But once a year, we got to release 10,000 lions into the city and just let men hunt the lions once a year, just so then there's just a thing that we're just naturally designed for. That we can do
Yeah.
and fulfill our
Good
natural,
idea.
and then women will be like, oh, good, we need that, and you can't get the ick if we're out there spearing a lion. So
Yeah,
anyway,
and I
that's a
think
stand-up joke I'm
that's
working on.
that's a really good point. Not that I suggest we do that, but what's interesting, I guess, compared to like say like my friends that own apartments and me owning a house, is there's always so many more opportunity that like Adrian's stepping into the cliche of his like masculine, like he does the bins, he does
Yeah.
the lawns, he does at the moment he's like rebuilding our studio that was damaged in the storms, and he's like completely rebuilding it and setting it up for Remy as a playroom, etc. Like he's doing all that physical labor stuff that I'm like, oh no, wait, I haven't taken the bins out once, not one time have I done that. And he actually probably does more of the domestic stuff than me as well. Like he's a very clean, tidy person, which I guess I'm very lucky for. But I think that's a really, really good point about that mother-child dynamic. It's very, very hard to come back from once you're in that. And there's a lot of contempt, a lot of dissatisfaction, and a lot of snarkiness that comes alongside that relationship dynamic where someone feels like they are having to organize, dictate, inform, educate, plan, etc., everything, whether it be domestic or emotional or all those responsibilities, and then or the incompetence of their partner, and then it is not conducive for a thriving sexual relationship, and it is quite hard to come back from. It's hard to resolve that and change that dynamic once it's in place, and there's so much resentment in there. Like, I find that people, when they get to a point of a lot of resentment in their relationship, sometimes it almost feels like you can't come back from that without doing a lot of work or even seeking therapy when you've got that much resentment, because it doesn't heal over time. It just accumulates over time. And it's really toxic and dangerous in your relationship.
And then you start to see things that wouldn't have otherwise been a problem.
Yeah.
And then because you're just so used to having that emotion of resentment or annoyance at the other person that everything starts to annoy you about them. Well, that's just like the cliche, if you're not annoyed at everything they do, you're not married. And you think, well, hopefully you can still avoid that situation. But also, there's got to be look, you're never going to have a perfect relationship or a perfect social organization. And there's always going to be some of these issues that pop up. And it's foolish to assume that you can expect everyone to read your mind and, do things the exact same way you do things. We're all different. We all have our strengths. We all have our weaknesses. So, by all means, I'm not trying to, in this podcast, suggest that, everyone who's in that manager role is always in the right and is justified in being as annoyed as they are. It's all very, very contextual. But yeah, you're right. It's such a common thing in relationships where, more often than not, it's the woman who's annoyed at the man for not partaking in the same level of emotional labor. I think a good thing for men, if they can afford it, well, for anyone, just try to live alone for a while. I mean, I know it's harder in a large city now, but live alone, and then it forces you to become the manager of not just the place you're living, but your life. And it will force you, especially if you sort of hit disorganizational rock bottom, if you want to call it that. It'll be the kick in the backside that that's what happened to me. I moved out at 22, and compared to then, I'm just a lot better at that sort of stuff now. And just 'cause you have to be, there's no one else doing it. So it's not for everyone. Some people get quite lonely, but living alone can be very helpful in that regard.
I agree. It was the best thing. I moved out when I was 19, and I lived alone over the period of time, maybe like a combined total of 2 years over the last 10 years or whatever since I've lived out of home, and it was just the best. Not only is it just has there's so much growth that can happen when you're not relying on other people, or you're learning things about yourself, you're managing yourself, you're figuring things out. I recommend that, just not even just for this aspect, but it's so healthy to do if you're not prone to, severe loneliness and isolating yourself, etc. It's definitely something to do if you can afford it, or if you can get an apartment. Good luck. But yeah, I highly recommend it. And I think as well, another thing that I haven't touched on is the emotional labor of being the person that everyone dumps they vent to you, or they go to you for things and go to you for support. Even venting's okay, but if it's what do I do about this? This happens. What do I do about this? I had a friend group where there was 3 of us, and one of my friends, she was an anxious person. She shared a lot. And I, as a person, am someone that loves to feel needed. It's like a trope I have, or some kind of complex. And so she would message me and this other girl basically daily. And I was thriving. I loved it. I loved being there to support her. It was the best time. I felt really close. I would always talk. But my other friend was like, I cannot cope with this girl messaging me 8 times a day about how her life is hard, how she's stressed, how she's anxious. I'm done with it. And their friendship ended, and they've never been friends since. She just come back from it. She was like, she expressed it to the friend, and then the one who had the anxiety and was oversharing and kind of venting a lot was like, okay, well, I won't do it. And she's like, no, I don't want you as a friend. Like, she just got so angry and so much resentfulness built up so fast. That she was like a bit like,
Ooh, that's messy.
I don't want to have to hold your hand through every single thing that happens to you in your day-to-day life. I don't want to talk through everything. I don't want to debrief everything. I don't want to have to solve every single thought that occurs to you. Figure it out yourself.
Yeah, there's the natural almost psychologist that emerges in a friend group, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah.
Someone
definitely.
who has to then take on everyone and everyone's
Yeah.
problems, and then what we're talking about in the last podcast, they're the sounding board for all the oversharers, and then they don't get to.
Yeah.
Well, then
Yeah.
sometimes if they have a partner, then they have to then often dump all that on the partner, or then they have to find an outlet for that. And yeah, these are tough things you can't really measure it.
Yeah.
And sometimes people don't have boundaries, and then that's why they end up being in that role. But then, is it on that person? It's just all these situations are very they're unique to each individual context.
Yeah, exactly. And it is one of those things that it's your responsibility to communicate and resolve it if it's impacting you, and it's also your responsibility to be aware if you're that person that is like dumping things onto everyone, or asking someone to going to everyone all the time or whatever. It's something that you have to be really conscious of. And my one of my closest friends, she is a social worker, and she works with like in a really, really intensive role where she sees a lot of trauma, similar to what I did, but more hands-on with even in the homes of families, etc. And she is with someone, and he's very like a verbally expressive, and he loves he's kind of like one of those like funny, pessimistic type personality types where he likes to complain, but he's like a really like nice and enjoyable guy, but he's a bit of like pessimistic. So he'll come home and he'll be like, this fucking person did this and this happened. And she's like, okay, well, like I literally had to help an ice addicted baby taken from the hospital and cared for it. Like she had so much trauma in her day to day that she'd come home, and instead of being able to relax, her partner would come home and it'd be like, he was just making conversation, because that's just the person he is. But she was like, I can't, like she's just taking on so and so much, and she didn't want to tell him because she's such a compassionate and empathetic person. She didn't want to discourage him from like unwinding about his day. But she was like, God, I need time to myself, or time to even just talk about my issues. So I don't even know what ended up happening with that, but it's a very common, it can be a common thing.
And those people,
inequality of venting.
Yeah, but those people they do have to tell the other person. There's a nice way to tell them, but
Exactly.
because otherwise it'll get
Yeah.
pent up, and then it'll come out one day in an unhealthy way, and then the other partner will feel unfairly attacked, and then that's just a much worse situation. But then if someone does say something like that to you, it's not something to get immediately defensive about.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're complicated because they're very, if a partner said, hey, I don't like the way you talk about work after I come home from work, you can easily get defensive over something like that. So
Yeah, like, I don't want to hear about your day.
yeah, yeah.
Stop complaining, you whiny bitch.
Yeah. So you got to figure out ways to say that well, but
Yeah, just figure out. I always find, like, is there a time of day that helps, like, that's better for you? Would you rather do it on your way home? Would you rather do it after you've had a few hours to relax, to have those, like, connecting conversations where you talk heaps in detail about what your day went? Like, Adrian calls me every single day at 3:30 p.m. on his way home from work. We speak for like 40 minutes, and not much happens at his work, but every single thought that he had that day, he would just kind of tell me. But I like that. That's a time where I'm like, 3 o'clock for me is the most boring time of my day. So Remy and I are like sitting by the phone waiting for him to call. But prior to that, I'd always be like, when I get home from work, I'd be like, okay, I need to like decompress for like an hour. I'd actually just go to my bed. I'd be like, hi, kiss, hug, and go to my bed for like 25 minutes, sit, and then come out and have a conversation. So it's funny how it changes over time, but figure out like when is the best time for you to have like the capacity to have conversations, not necessarily bad conversations, just be willing to like sit and talk. Like I'm also one of those people that when I have like food, I want to just eat my food in peaceful silence if I'm eating alone. And like if a friend calls me, I will stop eating so that I can enjoy my food afterwards. But if someone's talking to me while I'm eating, I'm like, I just want to eat this food. Like, can you come back in 5 minutes? Like, it's funny, but it works when you know, like, this is when I'm going to feel the most peaceful. I'm going to have the most capacity to have this conversation. Just communicate it.
Yeah, no, totally.
Like, how does that work for you? Because, like, when do you, like, clock off? When's the time for you?
Nighttime. Nighttime. If I don't have a show, nighttime.
Yeah. Right.
And then it's sort of maybe there's a little lunch break I give myself. So those 2 times.
Aww.
Yeah.
Little lunch break.
Well,
Someone pick one.
Recess. Those 2 times probably, yeah. But yeah, it's probably easier when you're living alone because you don't have to then necessarily navigate what someone else might be doing in that situation. I don't know how big families do. I guess if you're in a really big family, you get used to things like that, and that's why they're always fighting with each other. But there's also benefits to that. Like I said in the last podcast, loneliness is such a it's the physical ramifications of loneliness, not just the mental, are really morbid, and you've got to do something about that. It seems like an easy fix, really. Just get off your phone and go out. But if you've trained yourself to be used to being alone, then it's a lot harder to do. But
especially if you have social anxiety.
Yeah, and
anxiety,
then the anxiety gets worse if you're just alone all the time. So a little bit of healthy exposure wouldn't hurt, and that's where it's very different if you grew up in a big family. There's no real, often people don't even get the opportunity to be alone. So be interesting how they sort of, I don't imagine the emotional labor involved in, say, a family of 5-6 kids would just be, that'd just be ridiculous.
Honestly, you wouldn't get a second, not even a minute to yourself. I do find, like, when you said, like, you get used to it, like, I'm sure, like, there is the aspect of that, but I also feel that some people would take to being needed and touched out and having to organize these things and being a parent, etc., really naturally and thrive in it. And I think other people really struggle with being like, okay, I actually had to sacrifice a lot of my identity, a lot of my hobbies, a lot of just time to sit and have a cup of tea that's like a rarity, or even having a hot shower for more than 4 minutes. Like it doesn't come naturally to some, and it's just like, well, shit, I can't do much about it now. Let's see what methods I can put in to help me cope better. But yeah, it is one of those tricky things. I actually saw a post I was talking about this with Adrian, I saw a post on Reddit the other day where this man was commenting, made a post saying that he hates his wife. He resents his wife because they have 3 children and he doesn't like his kids. He hates being a father. And these kids were like 11, 9 and like 6 or something years old. So he's been a parent for a while. And everyone was like, well, why do you hate your wife? Like, it takes 2 people to have a baby. Like, shouldn't you have learned that after the first, or if not, second child? Why are you punishing her for it because she had another child? But it was interesting. And then I looked at his like post history, and he was posting a lot on different like forums about like, he regrets kids so much and he hates them. He never connected. And then people were saying back to him, for the sake of your children, divorce your wife so your kids don't grow up feeling your regret and feeling your resentment, because they are already guaranteed to be like absolving that and feeling that from you and that kind of energy. So it is one of those things that's like once once the baby's born, it's hard. You can't really undo it. Or if you do, it's a very, very dark and heavy path to go on. And I don't mean murdering babies. I mean like relinquishing care, but just disclaimer. So yeah, like, you know, take the chance to live alone while you can. Have that time, get that out.
A little cry came
enjoy
in
it,
just
embrace it.
that was the appropriate time.
Yeah, exactly.
It's, I mean, look, I mean, with some of those, sometimes people are just at their wits' end and just need to vent, and they'll say things that they don't necessarily mean.
Exaggerate.
I mean, it's a bit different when you type something out, and in some of those situations, you want to give people a space, even if you might, if say he was saying something like that to his partner. Oh well, look, something like that would be that's a tough ask, but in some situations, people say things that the partner, they're at their wits' end, they're just burnt out, and then they'll say things, they're just venting, they're not really thinking about what they're saying, and they say a lot of things that they don't necessarily mean, that are indirectly very upsetting to the partner. And this may be another situation where emotional labor is needed, and you need to just sort of take that on if you're the partner, and you can tell that they don't mean it, and it's out of the ordinary for them to say something like that. It's just, more often than not, they're totally venting and they're at their wits' end, and you just need to, you know, as they say, that all this stuff about giving people a space without judgment, you got to do that. And it's the thing with that is it often takes a certain level of emotional labor of the person listening to do that.
Yeah.
Especially if it's in a relationship.
Yeah.
Because if someone's saying like this, you know, it may not be directly offensive to the partner, but hey, this relationship isn't working for me. I feel bored. I feel trapped. Trapped is a big one. When someone says trapped, it's very hard for the other person to not take it personally.
Yeah, I would take that personally for sure.
Yeah, it'd be hard not to. But it, you know, if it's a situation where there's other things in their life that might be causing that feeling, and then they're, you know, thinking it's the holistic situation of the relationship, but in fact it's just the work, or you know, there's ways you can sort of work around that and think about ways to deal with that, rather than just, you know, the immediate response would, for a lot of people, would be defensiveness, and you know, it takes quite a strong person to not get defensive in that situation, and I usually do as well. But you know, looking back at a few situations like that, it might often be better for someone to see what they try to analyze what they're indirectly saying, read between the lines, as opposed to just hearing what they're directly saying.
What's actually beneath this, and what's going on outside this moment for this person. And I think that what's interesting is that, and this links in, I guess I'll get to that point in a minute about mental health, but that emotional labor falls onto the partner. If someone says, I'm trapped, if someone said that to me, I now hold that emotional labor of being like, okay, I can react because that offended me and that hurts my feelings, and now I'm scared of losing them. But in reality, I'm going to have to rein myself in and approach this conversation with empathy and compassion. And that's hard to do because my initial first thought was, I feel threatened. Like my relationship feels at threat. And that's the emotional labor. Like, okay, now I have to put in a face of empathy, or even like to other extents where someone says, like what I've mentioned before, that I often have people messaging me saying, from that listen to this podcast, saying a very frequent issue that comes up for them is they find themselves attracted to another person, whether it be a colleague or whatever. And I never ever give direct advice on you should tell your partner or you should not tell your partner this. I only normalize that and just like talk about it as a whole, and what they can do individually, but I never tell someone directly like how to navigate that with their partner. And some people choose to tell their partner that because they want to be really honest and open, and other people are like, well, I'm going to work through this, I'm going to get rid of this, like, you know, crush, and not tell my partner. And I don't have actually any opinion on whether one avenue is better than the other, but imagine being the partner and hearing something like that. Again, of course, your first initial thought was you'd feel hurt, or you may feel hurt, or you may feel threatened, or perhaps you feel like honored, like thank you for being so respectful and being so honest. And like that would be an extremely emotionally intelligent reaction that not even I would probably have. But it does take a lot to then be like, okay, like let's talk through this, even though your relationship might feel threatened to you on a subconscious or physical level, that you then have to be like, I need to remain calm and give this space to that person. And I guess that was going to be our next point, of when someone in the relationship might have ongoing and regular mental health concerns, you do have to be conscious of the emotional labor of the person that is there to support, that is supporting you through that, whether they be like the daily venting, the checking if you've had your medication, checking how they can support you, holding you while you cry. Like there is such things as caretaker fatigue, etc., that happens, and burnout is so serious. And when people get burnout in their relationships, especially if the cause of relationship is due to burnout, they themselves get blind. Like they might not recognize, I'm just so tired from this, and this. This is the support. I mean, they might just be like, I can't do it. I'm stepping out. I'm gone. So that's another really important point, is to recognize, like, if you're the receiver, or if you're the person that you feel holds the most emotional labor, be conscious and understand the signs of burnout, and be aware if you see those coming, that you need to intervene early, because when it's too far gone, you make rash decisions. And the thing is that you make a decision on impulse, but you might not realize I was burnt out till 3 years later. It's like, you're not going to come back the next day being like, oh, sorry, I was too exhausted. You might feel settled, be like, no, I needed to divorce, or I needed to do this, or I needed to leave my kids and move countries, and only recognize that years in the future that, oh, this was burnout.
And if someone is anxiously attached, they can often deliver quite direct criticism, and actually the underlying message they're saying is, hey, I need reassurance that you really like me, which is a very difficult situation for the person receiving that, because they are quite literally being verbally attacked. Attacked is a strong word. They're being criticized, and it's actually in some ways an expression of commitment and love, but just in a toxic, anxiously attached way. And then that person has to do what you say, where they take on the emotional labor and say, oh, all right, they said that thing about me, I got to just kind of. That's not directly what they're saying. What they're indirectly saying is, I felt some doubts this week, and now I'm going to try to challenge the love that you have for me to see if it's actually there. And it's very hard to do in that situation. But
it's so hard, because that person, the anxious attached person, because it's so subconscious, often they don't even realize, when I accuse you of checking out this girl, or when I accuse you of not loving me because you didn't notice my haircut, they're not aware that on the subconscious, they're sometimes not aware that on a subconscious level, it's stemming from I am seeking reassurance of our love. And instead of asking for it, they find a way to instigate a conversation or a narrative, or whether or not they often truly believe it as well. They create a situation because they're trying to make that need met. So it's really hard, because it requires them to have emotional intelligence to realize, like, this is what's beneath it, and that shouldn't fall solely onto that partner being like, oh, what they're seeking here is love and affection. It's also that person's responsibility to cut all that bullshit out to begin with.
Yeah, that's very
preferably
true.
And be like, hey, can I have some more cuddles tonight, and can you reassure me of your love? That's just what I need.
Yeah.
It's hard.
That's true. It's
very hard.
It is hard, yeah. But
attachments, then we're in a whole different other ball. We need a whole another podcast to even go through that. Yeah.
Well, I've done a few on those, so you can check back through the catalogue. I think we've covered that quite well. By all means, let us know in the comments, or on Instagram or TikTok if there's anything we didn't cover, or if there's another topic that you'd like us to explore. But do you have any final words on this one?
No. I don't think I've said it all that I can think of. But yeah, just good luck, and don't feel like you have to take the responsibility on for others, and you're not responsible for other people's emotional reactions or regulating those people, and communicate your needs. So that would be my final piece of advice. As always, I guess. It's always what it comes down to, isn't it? Just communicate.
Yeah. Shout out to all the managers out there.
Yeah.
We see ya. Keep doing what you're doing. All right. Well, thank you for listening, everyone. See you next week.